So you've seen aircraft all over the sky, all around you, and then suddenly all the lights go out and it's dark everywhere except up ahead. And up ahead we could see what seemed to be twinkling lights. And we're trying to figure this out. Are they people signalling to each other on the ground? As we got closer, it was very evident that what it actually was anti-aircraft fire from H3 airfield where we were going. There's no way we didn't get through that. I'm Mal Craghill. I was a navigator in the RAF for 30 years, and the aircraft behind us, ZA465, I had quite a long association with, particularly through the 1990s when the aircraft was coded Fox Kilo, later known as Foxy Killer from the Gulf War. I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but I was the youngest Tornado GR1 navigator out in the war, and I dropped the last RAF bomb of the war. So looking back on those two things, neither of which I knew at the time, that's actually a big deal for a young guy to have done all that and to go through the war. And I flew 24 missions, 22 of those over the border. You know, there aren't many people who flew much more than that. So I think, yeah, I'm proud of what I achieved at such a young age. One of the aircraft that the Tornado was designed to replace was the Vulcan bomber. So that had a crew of 5, 2 pilots, 2 navigators and an air electronics officer. And when the Tornado came along, it's reduced down to a crew of 2. So 1 pilot doing the job of the 2 pilots in the Vulcan, and the navigator in the back doing the job of 2 navigators and an air electronics officer. With it being a 2-man cockpit, it's very much a team approach. The Tornado was one of the first electric jets, so there's a lot of systems in the aircraft to help with navigation, but they were quite early technology. If you're wearing a smartwatch now, that has dozens of times more computing processor power than the Tornado main computer did back then. Had variable geometry wings, so the wings would be swept forward for slow speed flight, particularly for takeoff and landing. For routine low level flight, the wings would be back at about 45 degrees of wing sweep. And then for very fast flight, the wings would go all the way back to a 67 degree sweep, which allowed it to have a lower frontal area, less drag, and be able to fly faster, more efficiently. So what that design allowed is for the Tornado to be optimised for all different types of low-level flight. This aircraft was a dream to fly. You could engage the terrain following radar, which sits underneath the ground mapping radar in the nose, couple that up to the flight director system and the autopilot, and you could fly completely hands-off in dreadful weather down to only 100 or 200 feet above the ground. So for what it was designed for as a low-level attack aircraft, a brilliant design. The day that Saddam Hussein's forces invaded Kuwait, I was actually flying some dissimilar air combat sorties against Harriers from Gütersloh. We got a call over the emergency radio frequency to say all RAF Germany aircraft return to base. As it became obvious that things weren't going to resolve quickly, we started getting into a workup for the Gulf. From late September until I deployed in early December, 2nd of December I think I went out. I flew 50 hours, pretty much evenly split between day and night, all of it focused on getting Gulf combat ready, for want of a better phrase. When we got out to theatre, there was still work flying to be done. The most important thing initially was to erode the Iraqi air defences, the IADS, Integrated Air Defence System. So that meant taking out the radars that would see us coming. It meant taking out the missiles and anti-aircraft guns that could shoot us down. And it meant preventing their fighters from getting airborne, or if they did get airborne, then having our fighters airborne to shoot them down. Going against the radars and the missile sites, very high threat. So luckily the F-117s had just come into service. That was the sort of thing they went off to do. There were other coalition assets that could do the suppression of enemy air defences very well, including some of our own Tornadoes carrying the air-launched anti-radiation missile. So for us, our job was to focus on the airfields, to try and prevent the airfields being used, or harass them at least to make it difficult for the Iraqi aircraft to get airborne. So airfields were the initial target for the Tornado force, all low-level attacks. Partly that's driven by the threat, because at high altitude there's a lot that can kill you. At lower level there's less, not much less, but a bit less. and partly it was driven by the fact that our best anti-airfield weapon was the JP233 back here, which has to be delivered straight and level at low level across a runway. The system comprises two separate canisters. The rear canister contains 30 runway cratering submunitions, and the front canister here contained 215 anti-personnel mines. This represents one system. The Tornado would carry two of these, and in interplay between the main computer and the settings you make on the canister here, you could tell the system that you were going to do either a short stick attack, which would space these munitions out over 650 metres, or a long stick attack for taking out the length of a runway, which would space all that out over 4 times that distance, so 2,600 metres. And the computer would just time it to release the 30, 60 overall, 30 from each canister, cratering submunitions along the length of that 2,600 metres. And likewise with the anti-personnel mines, they would spread out across the whole length of the attack. So the first night we were targeted against an Iraqi airfield, Al Assad, bigger than Heathrow, 8 aircraft going against it. It was never going to be an easy task to close it down, and we were using JP233. So we had a channel fault that meant we could only drop one half of the JP233. We opted to go with that because that was better than nothing. So we got airborne, but once we got airborne, our radar wasn't working either. So we had to turn back that night. We were up again the following night, another JP233 attack, this time against H3 airfield. As we crossed the border, all the aircraft go lights out, crossing the border, and up ahead we seemed to be twinkling lights. As we got closer, it was very evident that what it actually was anti-aircraft fire from H3 airfield where we were going. The boss, who'd been out the night before and seen what bad AAA looked like, looked at this and he just said, "There's no way we're going to get through that. We need to preserve the aircraft if we can. No point doing this." So he terminated the attack and told us to find targets of opportunity if we could. So we ended up rolling out, heading south, and there was an auxiliary Iraqi airfield about 15 miles on our nose. So we made a quick decision to target that. As we started that attack, out to our right, it looked like we were being fired at suddenly. What it turned out was that was one of our other aircraft doing the same attack. They were dropping their JP233 really quite close to us. And at some point in the dark, we must have crossed paths with that other Tornado. So we rolled out more or less parallel with one another like this. And somehow we didn't hit them. As soon as the airfields were put out of action to a sufficient extent, we could, and the air defences had been worn down somewhat, so the missiles were less of a threat, we moved up to medium altitude. And that, I understand that had always been the plan. It came as a little bit of a surprise to us because the Tornadoes are not a low-level aircraft. It's optimised for low-level flight, and we hadn't done a lot of practice of medium altitude bombing, and it meant switching to medium altitude level bombing where we'd be up at about somewhere between 15 and 20,000 feet, level approach to a target, and just as they'd done back in the Second World War or in Vietnam, you release your weapons from medium altitude, turn away and fly home and hope that the bombs hit. We were attacking some targets west of Baghdad, and on this particular night it was an infrastructure target. If I'm honest, we got a little bit complacent about the defences, so we were all flying a very similar attack track. The thinking, I think, was that the defences had been worn down, it would be less obvious which directions we were coming from anyway. We soon learned this was quite naive thinking. So on the run into this attack, we saw missiles being fired, nothing coming towards us, that's fine. We're on the final run into the target. We're getting close to weapon release when the radar warning receiver it's been picking up target acquisition for the SAM-2 system down in our 2 o'clock. That switches and we get an alarm in the cockpit and it switches to target tracker. Now the system is locked onto us. The alarm tone changes to a loud warbling siren. The display switches to SA2 missile guidance. At that exact moment, there's a massive flash on the ground as a SAM-2 missile comes off the rails. Because it was quite a short-range firing, we could see the missile throughout its time of flight. We made a very quick decision to finish the attack because we were so close to weapon release. Mike's watching the attack symbology, I'm watching the missile, making sure I'm still putting out chaff and that the pod is jamming the radar that's associated. And then as soon as we feel the weapon release, Mike puts the aircraft into a hard downward turn, pulling in towards where the missile is. The aim of this is that the missile is always trying to predict its impact point. So by turning hard, it now has to think ahead to where you're likely to be, and that keeps changing. So the missile has to maneuver hard, and that hopefully increases its miss distance. Something in that combination of chaff, jamming and aircraft maneuver did defeat the missile to the point where it didn't hit us, but it went off somewhere behind us with a big bright flash, close enough that we felt the blast from it, but we didn't seem to have sustained any damage. That now puts us, we've now lost quite a lot of energy doing that, even though it's a downwards turn. The Tornado doesn't maneuver efficiently. So we were now lower than we would like to be and slower than we would like to be. So the one thing you don't want to do at night is use your afterburners, because it would highlight your aircraft position, but that's exactly what we had to do at this point to get back up to height, back up to speed, and get away from some of the anti-aircraft threats. With us on every mission, we carried certain items of escape and evasion equipment. One of these is a Silk escape and evasion map. So if I ever ejected from the aircraft inside Iraq, I would have a map that could help me orientate where I was in relation to some of the bigger pictures. So there's Baghdad and the lakes out to the west of Baghdad. We carried other items with us as well, a bandolier with some gold coins and various other escape and evasion equipment. We also had what's called a promissory note, which was a promise of a certain amount of money. In this case, it was £15,000, that if somebody found you having ejected and picked you up and took you to safety, specifically the nearest British embassy or a friendly nation, then they would be paid the sum listed on the promissory note here. I dropped the last RAF bomb of the Gulf War in 1991. I didn't know that it was at the time. We were pretty sure it was one of the last missions, and when we got back, we'd actually finished debriefing when we heard that the ceasefire had been called. So we knew we were one of the last out there. But it turns out that that we were on the last mission of the war, and that Mike and I dropped the last RAF bomb of the war from this aircraft. So Foxy Killer was the aircraft we were flying that night, loaded with laser guided bombs, just like the ones that are on here at the moment. And this was our mission map from that night. The map is marked with certain things like here it says EF-111, which is to indicate to me as I'm flying that our jamming aircraft are off out to the southeast of us here. That's important to know, because when they start jamming to target the radars of these missile systems, I'm likely to get spurious indications on my radar warning receiver in the cockpit that was happening. So we knew where they were, we knew when they would be doing their jamming, and that would help us just to know if we got indications in the cockpit whether it was likely to be a real threat system or not. Did I feel safe going flying every night? The answer is no, categorically not. Right to the end of the war, they were still firing guns and missiles at us. In the book sense of did we win air superiority? Yes, locally, fairly quickly. There were parts of Iraq you still wouldn't want to fly into. Around Baghdad, there was a lot of defences, so the missions there, even right at the end of the war, the missions around Baghdad were still fairly high threat. We lost quite a few guys. That's always traumatic, and in fact we lost two of the flight commanders from my squadron. They went out one night and didn't return from a mission. Looks like they got shot down. So for us that was traumatic, because we weren't on that mission, but we were getting up the next morning to go in and plan for our next sortie that night, to hear that two of the flight commanders on the squadron are missing, presumed dead, which is a real big blow, and they were lovely blokes. So that side of it, there was no time to process the grief. You were getting on and doing the next missions, and I think that caught up with me some years later. Mike and I did our job whenever we were tasked to go and do it. We kept ourselves alive. We hit the targets we were tasked to go out and hit, and we did that night after night. And so I think at the end of the 6 weeks, we were happy to give ourselves a pat on the back and very ready to go home.